Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first talk of our speaker series. My name is Gustavo Flores Macias. I'm serving as the director for LASP this year. And it's a real pleasure to kick off our speaker series with Professor Picq's talk today. I'll let Judith Lopez introduce her formally, but I wanted to make sure that you knew that we'll be meeting here throughout for most of the talks. Normally, we've at times in other semesters met in different venues, so this will be our venue generally for this semester. And we have a great lineup. I hope you can join us for most, if not all. There's some food in the back. Please help yourselves. Also, there's some water in the back as well. If you haven't, please look for the sign-up sheet just to make sure we have your name. And of course, this is to email you announcements about that have to do with Latin America, but also just to get a sense of the interest that we have in the speaker series more generally, and hopefully be able to maintain it and continue with it. I'll stop there, and then I'll turn over the virtual microphone to Judith, and he'll introduce Professor Picq formally.
Thank you, Sal. So I am so pleased to introduce Manuela, who's a very dear friend, Manuela is a professor of international relations at the University of São Luís. She does work on Latin American extractivism, indigenous activism, plurinationalism in Ecuador, and the list goes on. Recently, she's been subject to, state violence and
to the new left. Subject to the new left.
And I followed what happened to her recently with much concern and dismay, and I'm so excited to have her speak to us today. And thank you so much for coming.
There's seats over here, there's seats in the back. Also, we're experimenting this semester with recording the talks and being able to post them on our website so that they have an impact beyond the immediate community here. So it's something new.
So thank you. Thank you, Gustavo, for the invitation, and thank you everybody for being present. It's nice that Ecuador generates some interest. So I propose there are many ways it could go, and I think maybe in the Q&A we can go in different directions, but what I thought I would do is to posit the relationship of the indigenous movement to the left in Ecuador. Maybe because a month ago, more or less when we were seeing what to talk about in this presentation, there was a big tension, and the indigenous movement was accused of not allying and cooperating with other political parties in an attempt to oust the current president, and that generated a lot of contestation about the role of the indigenous movement and its alliance with the left, which is against the new left and yet not aligning with the right. So I thought it would be interesting to see, who is the indigenous movement as a political actor, not only in Ecuador but in the Andes, because I think it's a very similar situation in Bolivia. So what I'll do is I'll start assuming that nobody knows in depth about Ecuador, so I'll just give a little overview about the history of the indigenous movement, which is the basics and how it is historically connected to the left and communism in particular. Then the levantamiento, the uprising of the 90s, which is when it becomes a political actor. And then the new left and the contemporary relationship and why it matters for political science and for anybody who studies Latin America, I think. So maybe to go to the origins, if you go to the Andes, the indigenous people, they talk to each other as compañero, right? And that's one of the many inheritance of communism. When the communists arrive in Latin America, they don't really have a base, right? A group to work with. Ecuador is not industrialized in the 20s, so they start collaborating with indigenous peasants, who were indigenous peasants and who become more peasants than indigenous, right, by this collaboration in the 20s, and who start advocating more than cultural rights, which were part of the demands. They start focusing more on labor rights and land rights. And there is this really, how do you call, synergy, 20s, 30s, 40s, between the creation of the Communist Party and the Communist agenda politics in Ecuador, which was very much based on labor rights, and the emergence of an indigenous movement per se. And the first indigenous organizations were created with the support of the Communist Party, and therefore along communist ways of seeing the world, right? The Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios, right, the Indigenous Federation of Ecuador, was founded in the 40s with the support of the Communist Party. And there's a lot of work together. This kind of disappears in the 60s and 70s with the Cold War. So when the military take over, when there is the context of the Cold War in the 60s, the communists are not, they're not helping the indigenous movement much anymore, because it's more criminalization and an image of radicalism than political support or helping to enter the political system. So then it's more liberation theology that supports the indigenous movements throughout the 70s. And agrarian reform, so let's see that since the 1780s there is an expropriation of indigenous land and labor that's more acute. And late 18, so the 1820s is right, the formation of the independent state in Ecuador. And from the 1820s to the 1880s, you have an accentuation of the exploitation of indigenous labor. And the haciendas were traditionally just colonial, become state-owned and republican at the turn of the century. And that's when actually the exploitation of indigenous people is the most violent. So the most protest appears in the 1910s, 20s and 30s, and that's when you have large uprisings and the support of the indigenous, of the Communist Party is strategic. With the liberation theology, it's a different moment in time, right? So these labor demands that were framed now become land demands, and the agrarian reform starts to be on the agenda since the 40s, and is the first wave of agrarian reforms arrives in 1963. And agrarian reforms in practice means that it's the end of indigenous slavery. The landowners, they own not only the land, but the Indians that were on the land, just like the cattle. So you would sell your piece of land with the cattle on the land and the Indians living on the land. So the amount of families living there. And it's only in 1963, with the first agrarian reform, that it ends. So let's keep in mind that there is a form of indigenous slavery in Ecuador until 1963, in the highlands. It's very recent. And that's 63 is the official end of slavery, but in practice it lasts and lasts and lasts. And so there is support of liberation theology, which is still the left, to get out of slavery and to get land and agrarian reform, but there's very little that really happens, and there's a lot of discontent among indigenous peoples. The right to vote for indigenous peoples only come in 1977. That's when I was born. I'm sure many people here were not born, so it's very recent. It's not history, right? When we talk about the end of slavery in Brazil, in Ecuador it's much more contemporary, the end of indigenous slavery. And so when we arrive in the early 80s, it's the end of the Cold War, it's the return to democracy in Latin America, right? The end of dictatorship in Ecuador is 1979. So the 80s is a lost decade in neoliberal terms, but not at all in indigenous terms, and it's actually a decade of a lot of effervescence, bubbling politically. So there's a consolidation of indigenous movements, right? So tendencies and local organizing becomes institutionalized. You have the first national indigenous organization, CONAIE, Confederación Nacional de Indígenas del Ecuador, created in '86. Ecuador, which is the highlands, is created in '79. And throughout the 80s, there is more and more mobilization and coordination within indigenous peoples. And we arrive in 1990, and there's a major uprising, which was planned, coordinated, to basically do what they always do, which is go to the streets and block the roads and paralyze the country. And they couldn't, there was so much effervescence that they couldn't hold it, and they actually went to the streets to block the country and take over churches, to use the church as a mediator between the state and the indigenous movement before the agreed deadline, the agreed day, because there was so much discontent. And so 1990, June 1990 was a key moment because there are about 2 million indigenous people who take the country, block the roads, there's no more gas circulating, no more food circulating, and the capital and Guayaquil de facto stopped working adequately. And long story short, the government is forced to go to the negotiation table with indigenous peoples. So that's a key moment, not only in Ecuador, but in all of Latin America, because if you think about it, 1990s, the 90s, 91 is when Colombia legalizes indigenous justice. The 90s is the decade when indigenous justice becomes legalized. It's the moment also where we start being able to think about Lula, about Evo Morales, and the arrival of Evo Morales in government is directly related to the emergence of this indigenous movement in Ecuador that becomes a legitimate actor, right? So it becomes possible to think about indigenous politics in a formal manner, not just street politics, right, but formal national politics. So there is the Levantamiento. In 96, the indigenous movement creates its own political parties, the first in the Americas. It's called Pachakutik. And so there's the first organization to emerge is the Highlands, which is the people who were enslaved in the haciendas. Then in 86, there's the national organization CONAIE. And in 96, there's the electoral branch of this, right? So it is really this, one of the scholars who thought about it is Donnelly Van Cott, who wrote about indigenous politics from movements to parties. And that really happens between 86 and 96. In 98, the Ecuadorian indigenous movement makes many alliances with formal parties and enters the government, putting many ministers in power, electing members to Congress, and is a very successful political actor. That kind of goes downhill because, of course, they allied with a neoliberal government, which soon started having problems because they promote free trade policies with the US, bilateral agreements. The indigenous movement moves out, there are fights, they leave the government. So by 2001, there is nobody left in the government or indigenous rights formally. The alliance is over, and there's a lot of deception that the indigenous movement could provide an alternative politics, like Lula, like Evo Morales, and did not deliver, right, the expected goods. But even if the indigenous party collapses in terms of electoral representation, it's very present in the collective imagination as an actor of contestation in Congress and in the streets, and as the only actor, political actor capable of mobilization in the country. The only social sector that really takes bodies to the streets, massive, is the indigenous movement. So it's an important political actor to ally with, and until Rafael Correa arrived in 2006-7, there was no one president who stayed in power without allying with the indigenous movement, right? So if the indigenous movement was against a president, it would ally with other sectors and approve the president. So this is the context in which the new left arrives in Ecuador, and in this case, Rafael Correa. Rafael Correa was nobody, was a university professor, right? Anonymous, like most economics professors can be in universities. He was a colleague of mine. He used to go dance every Friday with everybody. And he enters government as a finance minister first. He doesn't stay very long because he's not very good. And because he didn't obey the president, he bypassed the president on one occasion, making agreements with Chavez, which led many, opposition sectors to say that Chavez financed him since the beginning. I don't know, but he was fired. And then he returned to the university just for a couple of months and started his own campaign for president with Chavez support, financial support. And at the beginning, when he starts to run, he seeks for the indigenous movement to make an alliance. And the indigenous movement says, yes, you can be our vice president. And it's like, no, you are my vice president. And of course, they don't agree. They have a fight, and they both run. And at that point, they're both equally important or unimportant actor in 2005. But within 6 10 months, Correa becomes very powerful, and then at the end of his election, the second round, the indigenous movement looks for him for an alliance when it's becoming obvious he's going to win. And then it's Correa's turn to say, no, muchas gracias, que se vaya a la casa. So, this is to say that he enters his presidency with an electoral competition disagreement with the indigenous movement. They're not allies, and they have never been formally allies electorally. And he starts his presidency with a very strong discourse of redistribution, social justice, and with a very strong indigenous symbology. So his inauguration, he does it in Zumbao, which is a little indigenous town, Quichua village in the highlands. He calls in Evo Morales, he calls in Chavez. In various occasions, Rigoberta Menchú is invited to join. So the representation, the performance of indigeneity is always present. He wears indigenous shirts, right? So just like Evo Morales, he engages a lot the indigenous symbology to claim popular legitimacy, which even if the indigenous sector is not present, is an indicator of one, how indigenous politics are legitimate values in the mainstream and national spaces. And two, that's, I forget what is it, I'm going to say. It'll come back. Oh yeah, and the second one is how this historical alliance between the left and the indigenous, right? Nobody contests that a leftist, non-indigenous president is using this indigenous symbology because historically the left and the indigenous have been almost mutually constituting each other, right? Electorally, at least. So this is the starting point, and at the beginning he appoints various indigenous ministers. One example is Monica Chuji, who was Minister of Communication. She's an Amazonian woman. And there are a couple of others, but it's not the indigenous movement per se. Right? In 2008 there's a constitutional reform. And that constitutional assembly, the president promised it was going to be the most democratic ever, and it was. And every sector of society participated, including indigenous peoples, women, everybody. And the tensions start there because during the constitutional assembly there is already the indigenous discourse, so summa causae, the human right to water, the rights of nature. There are many values and indigenous principles that enter legally the constitution, and at the same time the president is pushing an agenda behind the scenes for a higher concentration of power in the hands of the executive and the capacity of the executive to nominate the judges, to bypass the constitution, to do a lot of things that are illegal, unconstitutional. So tensions start there, and during in the process of this 1 year of constitutional assembly, there is a levantamiento, a small uprising in the Amazon, in the town of Dayuma, which is a small town close to, on the fringes of the Amazon and the highlands, where many oil plants are located. So it's one of the gates right into the Amazon oil. And the people from the town, they block the road. I don't know, 200 people block the Amazon road, which is not a big deal. It's traditionally the way they use, to ask for more electricity, for a new school, to get some attention from the state. And Correa overreacts and sends in the military and beats the crap out of everybody. And it's remained called as the Dayuma massacre. I don't think anybody was killed, but if there were people killed, it was like 2-3 people. It wasn't, but a lot of people were beaten, tortured, jailed, including the mayor of the city. And the police would go into people's houses and grab all the men, drag them through the streets, beat them, and they jailed most of the men in town. So the excessive use of force for a traditional way of indigenous protest kind of like sealed the beginning of the tensions between the new left of Correa's government and the indigenous movement. And from then on it went downhill. And I won't talk about everything, but I would say that there is this parallel appropriation and increasingly more active appropriation of indigenous symbologies and agendas. Because it's not only wearing the clothing and using the language, it's also using concepts like the summa causae, the living well, buen vivir, into governmental agendas. So now every ministry has to have a buen vivir dimension in its agenda, if not it doesn't go through, for instance. But even the Ministry of Extraction and Oil and privatization of water, they are also integrating buen vivir to justify it along the lines of buen vivir. So it's so appropriate that it doesn't mean anything. You drive through the Amazon and you see like signs, outdoors, on the roadside of the road that says, el extractivismo, la minería es bueno para el buen vivir. Mining is good for well living. In the very communities that have cancer, right, that are dying of extractivism. So this appropriation is very grotesque and obscene and has been very problematic for the indigenous movement because the very agendas they have cannot really be claimed anymore politically. And in parallel to that, the government has been actively criminalizing indigenous communities. Dayuma was the opening point. I'll give so there are over 1,000 people criminalized in Ecuador. Even the allies of the indigenous movement are being criminalized and kicked out of the country. Two examples. There is a meeting about water and Mother Nature after Evo Morales organizes his in 2010 in Cochabamba, right, as a response to Copenhagen's failures. Correa organizes one in Otavalo, which is another indigenous town. Chavez comes. I don't know if Chavez was still around. Yes, Chavez comes. It was probably 2011 or 12. And Evo Morales comes. Do you think that the indigenous movement was invited to the table? No. Mm-hmm. So the indigenous movement, which was not particularly pro-nature, like the head at that moment was attacked from within of being right-wing, etc. But the indigenous movement and the president, they blocked the road outside Otavalo, and they demand to join the conversation. Again, police repression, arrests, and the head of the movement, Pepe Acacho, is jailed and accused with sabotage and terrorism and charged with 12 years of jail. This is one example, Germania. Fast forward 2013, Carlos Perez Guartambel, who is my partner and who's the head of, so he was the head of Cornell, the national, right, Pepe Acacho. And there's another one too who is criminalized. Then Carlos Perez is the president of Ecuador, the Highlands Indigenous Organization, which is from 79, which is the one that has the most bases, right, contact with grassroots activism. They block a road in the south of the country in defense of water, militarization of water plants that are being sold to China in context of mining. And he's also jailed, accused of altruistic terrorism. It's actually written on the paper of the courts. It's considered altruistic because it's in defense of water, but it's terrorism because they blocked the road. Also taken to jail. And then we have seen the last year increasing protests, all led by indigenous movement, if not only with indigenous presence. And indigenous peoples tend to be at the front lines many times, and they take a lot of beatings. Indigenous women have been beaten in their sexual parts, threatened with rape, their traditional clothing damaged, and then beyond, the local people are physically beaten and harassed, and this legal warfare from the states to the heads of the indigenous movement has been translated in terms of lawsuits, huge lawsuits that are impossible for one people to hold against the machinery of the state. Monica Chuji, who was the Minister of Communication in 2006, was one of the many victims of legal warfare from the government, who has these 5-10 years lawsuits on their backs. End up all at the Inter-American Court, but very hard to defend yourself, and you never know if they're going to show up at your house next week and throw you in jail. And so a very difficult way to continue participating in politics. And then it's getting to such overt levels of violence that a couple of weeks ago, Lourdes Tiban, who's an indigenous woman senator, congress member, was pushed to the ground and kicked, and it was filmed in front of Congress. There were a bunch of police officers present, nobody did anything. It was clear that it was people paid by the government to come and intimidate her. So this is happening a lot. And And I think it's important to think this relationship of leftist government with the leftist bases who elected it, and why they're unable to get together, and why there's so much criminalization. This is happening in Bolivia. The Tipnis, I don't know if you know about the Tipnis, but it's a national park in the lowlands of Bolivia. They're building a road that goes from Brazil through this Tipnis National Park, and the goal is to go to the Pacific coast, so Brazil can export soy to China, or not, long story short. But this national park was created by Evo Morales in the first place, back in the 90s when he was an activist, right? And now he's criminalizing, he sent the police to beat up people who were organizing to defend their territories against the road and the extractivism. Why are leftist governments elected by the left, by indigenous, even indigenous presidents, right? Or non-indigenous presidents but who claim indigenous legitimacy? Why are they criminalizing so much the indigenous movements and leaderships? And I think what's at stake is that the states of Latin America are states of extraction. And the left never promised or never said it was not going to be extractivist. The left was elected saying it was going to redistribute, it was going to change model of development away from neoliberalism, which it has not really completely done. But it never promised to find resources to redistribute in other ways than the extractive ones. And in fact, Dilma's and Evo Morales and Correa reactivated their extractive agendas and their developmental projects with Belo Monte, with drilling in the Yasuni, with the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. And they're mining more with the justification that it's for redistribute and taking care of the people. And there has been very little contestation of that model of development among leftist actors, who are mostly urban, students, workers, even women and Afro-descendant sectors have not been contesting this very much. The only sector that is contesting that, because it's living mostly in rural areas and has a different relationship with nature, are indigenous sectors. And so that's why this relationship is really interesting, and the tensions between the left and the indigenous are so crucial to study political science in Latin America, because it's about the origins of the states and the unchanging origins of the states. States in Latin America finance themselves through extractivism. That's why they were created with Potosi, to organize who has access to which lands and to which resources, right? To distribute the land grabbing, basically. And now if we look at Brazil, the whole thing of Dilma has a lot to do with soy, the agribusiness, and the land grabbing in Mato Grosso. Mm-hmm. And in Ecuador, it has to do with the land grabbing in the Amazon. It's still a state that distributes and organizes land grabbing and extortion, institutionalized extortion. And the left has not in any way challenged that. So there's this continuation of terra nullius, and I've written in the past about the doctrine of discovery becoming the doctrine of intervention and extractivism. Now it just has a leftist credential, and it's actually much harder to attack it or to challenge it. And maybe I wanted to finish with a number of why it matters, because when you study indigenous peoples or indigenous politics in political science and in international relations, it seems very marginal, and the hippie trying to save the world and protect the poor people. And it's actually much more complicated, because it's about us, it's about what kind of states we're building and what we're doing to our region, and it has to do with climate change and the climate crisis at the end of the day. And it's not enough to talk about the Anthropocene in our universities in the north and not realize how this is connected to indigenous peoples in Guatemala taking over the roads and the country and dying, like Berta Cáceres did last week in Honduras, or Nelson Garcia a week after her. And, so one number to bring to your attention, Global Witness is an international organization monitoring that, issued a report last year. In 2014, there has been two murders per week in the world of environmental activists. And over 40% of the victims are indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are only 5% of the world population. 5, but they're half the victims, almost, of environmental murders. People like Berta Cáceres. I'm assuming people know about her, but she was killed a couple of weeks ago. And Berta Cáceres was killed in total impunity, and a week after, Nelson Garcia is killed. So even if they're famous, even if they're recognized abroad, even if there is visibility and monitoring, we're watching you like the shame strategy from outside, it's not protecting them because the race for land and for land grabbing in Latin America, in Africa is huge, and there are actors like China behind, like India, like Brazil, in Mozambique, that are very hard to contest, and this is at the core of international relations. And so indigenous politics are key to world politics nowadays because they have to do with relations among states for land, because they have to do with climate crisis, and because if we just stay in Latin America, it challenges us from thinking the states differently. And when we talk about leftist politics and when we take the streets to maintain democracy, what kind of democracy for whom? Because the government of Dilma, who is at stake now, the rule of law that is at stake in Brazil now has not at all been a rule of law for indigenous people. Right? Their land has been sold left and right, and assassinations continue to go. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Bringing this extractive perspective to statements in Latin American politics, and maybe we can. I don't know, I'll let you define the direction of the conversation from now on.
So maybe what we can do this, I'll let you moderate, but what we can do is we'll just open the floor for questions and comments. If you could just please identify yourself, say your name, and then if you have either a comment or a question, just try to be brief so that everybody gets a chance to participate.
I'm Ann Peters, and I'm thinking about comparisons also with Peru. And I really like your analysis of the current situation. I think it would also be, in the introductory part, it would be enriched by looking at the colonial circumstance, the legal mechanisms of land grabbing, the obraje system and its relationship to both the indigenous people as indentured servants for hacienda systems and as obraje workers, and how that informed that confluence of the left with the indigenous.
Mm-hmm. Should we take I completely agree, and I didn't go in detail, but that's why the Communist Party was so crucial in the emergence of the indigenous organizations first and then movement. And that's why the indigenous claims are first claims to labor rights and then land. And it's only in the 60s that they start to have more formal claims for culture. Like the Quechua schools, bilingual schools, it's only like 63 that they start emerging with Tránsito Magoña. But the first organizing are labor rights, and there are icons like Tránsito Magoña. She traveled to Moscow with Fidel Castro when he was really young to go to the Soviet meetings about the international workers' rights, and they were very much embedded in that. And I met Tránsito Magoña before she died. She was like 99, I think, and she said, "I'm a communist." And until the end of her life, she was a communist because it's the communist party and mentality of integrating the subalterns that gave her a political self and allowed her to participate and to speak up politically. And it's certainly very important, not only in the highlands, but in the separate, like the way lands were grabbed and distributed by the state in the lowlands too. Like, the lowlands are empty lands, and the government having distributed the highlands 19th century. There's a grabbing in the earlier 20th century, and they distributed to workers who were just poor families who were suffering from drought in the south, and they send them to the Amazon to populate the Amazon.
Thank you. So let me take a few questions. 1, 2, 3. Oh, you don't have a question. 1, 2, and then in case there are 3. Okay.
I'm Brian Gengen. So I grew up in New England, in a town that has the densest indigenous population in all the region, and I'm white, and within that town, and within the tribe with whom I grew up, the Wampanoag, they're very, very clear about who speaks on their behalf. They speak in their own voice on behalf of their own tribe, and that's crystal clear, that dynamic. And on that point, I was wondering, you talked a lot about President Correa's appropriation of indigenous dress, of indigenous concepts, saying that when be the earth doesn't mean anything. Does it mean something still to indigenous communities? And what does that line look like for you in your work of kind of appropriation, speaking for on behalf of researching indigenous movements? And yeah, so that's one piece. And then the second piece, and then we can open up the rest of the folks who've asked questions, is you mentioned one improvement that has been made for indigenous communities in Ecuador throughout your entire speech. I was wondering if anything at all has come out of the Correa government in the time he's been there since 2006. Thank you.
I'm Rebecca, and my question was, other than the Global Witness, like is the World Wildlife Fund, or are there any environmental groups that are interested in helping the indigenous community, and would they be welcome in the struggle?
Okay. I'm sorry.
Okay. Starting with the last one, in Ecuador, the indigenous movement in the end is, I think, indigenous movements in Peru, I think it's very similar. They are much more willing to collaborate with other movements, I feel, than in the United States. It's a different history of colonization. The major ally of indigenous peoples in terms of nature right now in Ecuador, it's the Yasunidos, which is a young urban student movement for nature, environmental, and they really work well together. They really collaborate. It's not one helping the other in a Western way. They're really collaborating. So, for instance, when there is cases of consulta previa, like prior consultation in small communities in the south, the Yasunidos, they did that for the Yasunis, so they know they have the skills and the people to do, to collect signatures in a way that will be accepted by the government with the right color and the whole process. And so they come to the communities and they work with the people. They put bodies to collect signatures. They teach the others how to do it so they can do more signature collections. And they've been working together in many different cases, and not only environmental, actually. Then they used to have support from abroad, but one of the things President Correa did was to pass a legislation, the Decree 16 in 2013, that forbids national or like NGOs in general and associations, organizations, even like the organization of the parents of the soccer team of the neighborhood. Nobody can receive money and nobody can do political agendas. You cannot do politics, which can be used in any way by the state, so if the state doesn't like it, they say that your organization is doing politics and they can cut all the funds you have. And you cannot receive any funds from abroad that have any political connotation. So the indigenous institutions stopped receiving any funds from abroad. And it's nice to work together, but usually you need money to get stuff done. So it became one of the good things is that it really brought back some unity to indigenous movements that were becoming very fragmented, because everybody was working their own direction with different funds, and now all of a sudden they're working together again. The improvements of President Correa's administration for indigenous people have been really minimal. So let's say what has been done. One of the main things this government did in terms of redistribution have been roads, which are very important, especially when you live far away. To have a road to access the hospital or the school matters, but in 10 years it's not enough. right? But that has been done in the first years of the government. Of course, it's big money circulating, so all the elite sectors were happy to. Another one has been the Bono Solidario, which are minimum income programs. It's I think $50 or $40 in Ecuador for poor families, and the government dramatically increased the outreach of this program, so many more people receive it. Indigenous organizations complain about that because they say that's charity, and they don't want charity, they want to be able to have businesses and not make $40 a month. But that has increased a lot. Actually, Ecuador is the country in Latin America that spends the largest amount of its GDP on this program, the distribution, direct distribution. Then there have been directly to indigenous people, there have been more harm than good, not only in terms of extractivism, but if we think bilingual education that was legalized in the 80s. The president said that the schools were bad, which they were bad. They were so bad, the indigenous schools, that not even the indigenous leaders put their kids there. They prefer to put them in the public schools in the cities. But so the government decided to close them down because they're bad. So they didn't send more teachers, better infrastructure, they just shut them down. So the little practice of interculturality and plurinationalism that they existed disappeared. And instead, many other schools that were not necessarily bilingual also closed down in rural areas. We have this very small schools, so the government closed 4 different schools in little areas and created one bigger one. They call them Escuelas del Milenio. And they have more money, and of course, again, infrastructure, so that there is construction people happy behind because they build these big buildings. There's not more professors, not more books, but there is a new building. And the other 4 little schools are shut down. So that has meant there's no transportation added to take the kids to school, so many schools end up having to walk much more to access education. It's been complicated for them. That's one of the big complaints. I could keep going, but those are some examples. Speaking for the Indians, the Summa Causai has been, all of the leadership that I ever heard talk about it, they all, in different ways, say it's completely useless nowadays to talk about Summa Causai because it's so appropriated by the government that if you say Summa Causai, people have La Revolución Ciudadana in mind, and we can't use that anymore politically or even conceptually. So they're finding other ways to bypass and speak more specifically on the content of the Summa Causai. And on my end, I have to say that the only people that ever accused me or asked me about speaking up for Indians are non-indigenous peoples, so it doesn't concern me too much. I've always been supported by indigenous people and women and asked by them to go out and tell the world what's happening.
Why can't they come? Because my community, they're able to speak on their own behalf in a very articulate way. They're very smart, competent individuals, and as a white person, it's kind of like, in thinking of leadership development, it's, kind of taking a step back and being in the shadows and trying to, prop up that voice. Do they tour with you sometimes, or?
Do they what?
Do they tour with you? Are you able to travel as a delegation in your speaking tours? Can folks from the indigenous community who, when you're in Ecuador and you hear the leaders of Pachacutec and Conai, they're very articulate, smart people, and it's quite impressive, Do they join you?
I'm married to one of them.
Yeah, of course. So do they join you in the international realm, because you seem to?
No, they travel much more than me. They go to other venues. I think we should not make speaking for. I'm not speaking for them. I'm analyzing indigenous politics. Okay. It's very different. We are in an academic venue. And we study in academic venues the Amazon, and it's not only Amazonians. Susanna Hash is going to come talk about the Amazon. It's not only Amazonians who are entitled to talk about the Amazon. There are people who study the Amazon. I don't know what your subjects are studying. It's not only Mexicans who study Mexico. Sure. And it's very debilitating analytically to limit and to bring these, identity politics to the table, because that's not the point. Indigenous politics are not being studied enough. They need to be studied more and not less.
Yeah.
So do we have any more questions? 1, 2, 3, yes? Oh, yeah. 5?
Just one thing, in terms that now you mentioned the analytical part of indigenous movement. You are saying here, and everybody now assumes that Pachacutec and indigenous movement represent the indigenous community in Ecuador. That's not true, by far. I'm from Ecuador, and definitely the Pachacutic movement has diminished their role as representatives of the indigenous community, and they have become more, they are more interested in their own politics and things, and the thing with NGOs not stop funding indigenous movements is because those who benefited from those funds were just the leaders of those of the movement. You mentioned Tiban, and you know how much money she received from Holland and what she used that money for. She didn't use anything. You mentioned about the water in the indigenous communities, where before the government of Correa, water was just used to manipulate indigenous communities, saying if you don't give me this or if you don't give me boats, then we are closing the water for you. So now it's more democratic, it's more open.
Which one with the water? Who was
The water, the president of the water, before that was the presidents that control the water in the Andes region of Ecuador. Like
Which
the juntas, las juntas del agua.
Claro.
Yeah. So they had the right to give water or not to give water to the indigenous community. So that was not democratic at all. So I just see that you are mentioning that we are now in academic perspective, then you should also have the other perspective from the other side, not just saying the history from one, telling the story from one particular viewpoint, where it's not objective and also gives the false sense to hear that Ecuador and the government right now is just killing indigenous people, put them in the prison, and what happened with in the massacre you mentioned is, what you didn't tell is the mayor went into radio and said people to go arm and fight the police, and somebody got shot by that irresponsible act of telling the people to get on arms and go on the streets, and that was the actual reason why he went to jail. So I think, and there is much more things that, I mean, for you, the question of not building, just the building, just answer it, but your question, like, building new schools, that's for people that didn't have schools before, that's something good. And the bilingual game that, the bilingual education that you mentioned, that was just a cover-up for the other left party, the MDP, just to get more money out of it, and Pachacuti financing some other stuff, which was, okay, so that's just what I wanted to mention.
Chris and then.
Manuela, nice to meet you, and thank you for the really sweeping overview of the relationship between indigenous movements and the left. I think you've been really demure in not bringing the biographical into this broad sort of sweep, and I'm very interested in your perspective as an ally of indigenous movements, and particularly your experience of being targeted through a form of lawfare, and the way in which your personal experience of being imprisoned and coercively expelled, in my opinion, from the state, may add nuance to this, also to your perspective as an ally. Thanks.
Yeah, quick question. So, Ecuador is, and you alluded to this, many presidents before Correa haven't been able to finish their terms, and many of them had arguably campaigned on the left and that had implemented policies that were not from the left or maybe consistent with the Washington Consensus and so on, and were ousted. And Correa now has been president since 2007, right? He was like 2006, became president in 2007. What is different this time? That he has been able to hold on to power, or stay in power, remain president for so long?
To end this round, Carla, and then we'll do one last round.
All right. My question has to do with what you think is going to happen next now that the elections are coming up next year. Correa is no longer running. It seems that the indigenous and peasant movements have been sort of divided. So not only CONAVE, but FENOCIN and FE San Isidro, FAD, all these other confederations of movements, seems like, well, at least based on my work in Ecuador, there isn't a cohesiveness between these movements. What do you think is going to happen between Pachacútec and Alianza País, which is a political party out of Correa, but also this emerging opposition, which is, I don't even know, it's Nuevo and a bunch of other right-wing conservatives. So what do you think is going to happen next year is sort of my question about this happening.
Okay, so I'll focus on those. On the first question of Jaime, I think I would have to disagree. I don't think I'm being biased by, I do consider myself as a serious academic. Las juntas de agua comunitarias, there was I think a lot of propaganda by the government to make us think that the Decree 016 was about to stop the influx of money into corrupt indigenous organizations, and that the parochial management of water was authoritarian and impeding the water to arrive to people. The new water law allows the privatization of water, and that's what the government wanted, and that's why they discredited the community management of water, which was always working well across the country. But I'll skip those concerns because I think they're more political than anything. In terms of cohesiveness of the indigenous movement, which you pointed, there's a lot of concern, and obviously the elite institutions of the indigenous movement do not represent all of the indigenous interests. That's not from today, it's from always in any political party, right? From the grassroots to the top, there is a lot of discontent and transformation of the agenda. And then within the indigenous movements, the main organizations do not agree with each other. So, you know, Ecuador, which is the highlands, a lot of their bases have different interests. The Amazon Indians have very different interests related to oil from the highland Indians. They are within the same organization of CONAIE, many tensions there. The Highlanders and the Amazons don't agree on almost anything, but they have to work together because of the big national picture. They still have common agendas. And then the electoral branch, the Pachacútec, plays the political game and doesn't agree with any of the other people within the indigenous movement. And most people, even within CONAIE, even the heads of CONAIE, do not feel represented by the elected representatives of Pachacútec. I don't think that's a specific problem of the indigenous movement. I think any political party has this problem anywhere. It becomes problematic in terms of when we say the indigenous movement oversweeping. And of course, indigeneity is something that's diverse. Indigenous peoples do not identify as indigenous, they identify as Aymara, Quichua, Shuar, Guarani, Navajo, whatever it is in whatever their context is. We non-indigenous call them indigenous, and we tend to homogenize what is in fact extremely diverse. They're colonized populations that were colonized in different contexts and that have different agendas of contestation with the states, depending on their context. So maybe how do I come into that? I started working with indigenous women, and I'm very critical of the indigenous movement, but from a gender perspective. I've written against certain leaderships that are not going to say represented, but those who read my work will find it. I work for indigenous women's rights because there's a lot of violence within the indigenous movement, and that's where I come from into the movement. And when I was working for Al Jazeera, I met Carlos on an interview about water rights, because in the context of the water laws. And it was, I came in, but I'm very critical of many of the leaderships who silence gender discrepancies, and they ask human rights for the movement, collective human rights, but they fail to respect the individual human rights of women, and they accuse them of being Western feminists and influenced by Western feminists. And of course, now that the indigenous movement is in a moment of extreme pressure by the government, there is more unity and there's more agreement, but I am certain that if the next government comes in and is less, is criminalizing less the indigenous movement, the internal differences will pop up again. And I don't think we should measure indigenous success or indigenous political success by the unity of the movement. There's a problem of representation, totally. and there will be more and more and more because there's more people coming in and different diverging interests. And some people want to go urban and want the petroleros in the Amazon and want to make money out of them, and others don't. What's interesting is that indigenous politics are on the agenda and are one way of organizing demand. And that was not a reality in the mid-90s. It appears in the mid-90s. And that's there to stay. And it's making demands on the state, and it's making us thinking about the state in terms of extractivism, which we were not 20 years ago, which is something parallel to what we're doing with the Anthropocene in Western academia, thinking the climate crisis, right? We're thinking about status and politics in ways we were not before, and there can be a fruitful collaboration between these two. It's been difficult personally to be expelled from Ecuador because I built a life there, and I'm an ally and I'm not. A lot of people in the indigenous movement did not see me as an ally before until I was expelled because I was, I was a feminist. I don't know, I think I was expelled in many ways, and that's why my situation gained so much visibility too, is that I was expelled as an ally of the indigenous movement, as the partner of Carlos Perez, as a journalist. Journalists have been extremely harassed by the government, persecuted. As an academic. At the time it seemed invisible, the academic unfreedoms coming up, but it was already underway. There is control of the syllabi that we write. Now the Universidad de los Andes is being, the government's trying to take over. I don't know if it's going to go through or not, but there is a lot of academic pressure in the country going on. So I think my case echoed or symbolized in one case. And let's be honest, there's a lot of racism in Ecuador. I'm a white person, so everybody rallied behind me, did not rally behind the women of Sarajevo who were beaten 3 days after me. So it allowed to show a lot of the violence that was going on from a right, not a right wing, but from a conservative perspective, because it was not challenging the racial inequalities in the country. And I was talking to colleagues now at the ISA this week, the International Studies Association. It's ironic because in Ecuador people love me and I'm a hero because I'm white, because indigenous people have been doing much more than me for much longer, right? Let's be honest. And then outside the country, people like me because I'm helping the indigenous peoples, right? With this very romantic imagery of, let's save the Indians. And so in a way, this story became a narrative embedded in many racisms, in many inequalities, local and global, and it's being used for various purposes. And of course, the press says I'm a journalist because they want to call attention to the criminalization of the press. The indigenous movements that I'm an indigenous ally because the feminists that I'm a woman and femicide and violence in women's bodies, etc. So everybody's telling the story from its own perspective. Why not? What is certain is that this government has had more money than any other government in the history of Ecuador. The prices of oil were hitting the roof. The expansion of concessions in the country grew a lot. The sudden arrival of China allowed the president to maintain a discourse of anti-imperialism while... And Chavez was around too. So not only we were making money as a country, so it's easier to remain in power when there's money, but Chavez was filling in with a lot of money too. And I think there's something that has been done by Chavez, Evo Morales and Correa that should not be undermined, as much as many sectors want to get rid of them, specifically the sectors who benefit from what I'm going to say right now. But these presidents have increased the self-esteem of Latin America and of the subalterns in Latin America. And if not from a political perspective, because there has been a lot of political criminalization, but from a narrative, from a political narrative, there have been an integration and inclusion of those sectors in the agenda. So in a way, it has been made easier to participate, even though it's been harder to. And so Correa stayed in power because he had more money than anybody, and because he was very smart in terms of, he had more support than anybody. He had 70% of the vote at the beginning, right? And he came with a very new agenda, not only in content, but in format. He brought a lot of young people into the government. And so, young people come in and you're patient. And the first years everything was okay, and then you're patient. 2010 there were already many problems. You're like, no, it's going to get better. And then 2013, you realize, no, it's not going to get better. And then people started going to the streets in 2014, 2015, lots of criminalization in the last 2 years. And it's like Chavez, the increased, like, freedoms have been taken away one by one strategically, and by the time you try to react, there is no way. And the judiciary is in the hands of the government, the legislature is in the hands of the government. All these decrees that were done to block the influx of money have generated weakness in the social movements, fragmentation, incapacity to organize, to fly, to meet. So I think it's a combination of that, and the press has been a very strategic point, right? Under a discourse of, so the press in Latin America has traditionally been in the hands of the right sectors and the elites. So in an attempt to deconcentrate this monopoly of media in the rights of the hand, the government has created a state monopoly. So the discourse is of public communication, public media, but in practice it has become state-owned media. And so there is one narrative that keeps being reproduced. And you can see it in Ecuador and outside of Ecuador here, how certain narratives and frames of the government are being adopted as the narratives of what's happening in the country. And so that has convinced the government to stay in power too. What's going to happen now? Nobody knows. So now since everybody agrees that there's an authoritarian regime now, that it's unhealthy, that we need to move, but there is no good alternatives of where to go. And the only few who stay, I mean, the right-wing sectors, the very rich sectors of Ecuador have benefited a lot from these governments. The construction sectors, some laws that prohibited imports benefited big national industries, but not small business. The industrialization of Ecuador has failed the little that existed, but increased the monopoly of businesses like the supermarket, Supermaxi, chains like that. So the right is trying to ally with the left, which is pretty new, and that's another inheritance of this government, if you think about it, because before Chavez and Lula and Evo Morales, when would the right in Latin America try to ally with an indigenous sector? Never! And now they're trying. So that's, I think, a positive legacy of changing the political map. And so the indigenous sector is trapped, and I think it's not the only one, it's the most powerful, but the women's sector is trapped too, for instance, and the students are trapped too. They don't want to ally with the right, but at the same time, they don't want to ally with the left who is in power. And the left who is in power, so many people from the left participated with the left who's in power that there's few people left with legitimacy within the left that are eligible. So I think that what's interesting about the current scenario is that it raises questions about the left, how the left can reinvent itself inside and outside of government. And it's the same question in Brazil or in Bolivia.
So a couple last questions before we end. One, any two? Okay.
Thanks for your talk. I had a question about some of these questions Anthropocene in the extraction state. With the kind of success and failure of the Yasuni project and questions of ecological debt and attracting foreign capital to prevent extraction that ultimately didn't come through. I mean, do you think that with the rise of China that's just completely gone now? Any hopes of that? And where does the indigenous question then enter? Are those two things at odds moving forward, or do you think there's some kind of collaboration that might either protect these spaces, use them for redistribution, whatever the case might be, that's not extraction?
I was back in the Intag region in January, so I'm a little bit familiar with some of this. But I was sort of curious in what you were saying about the linking of, or the funding of redistribution with extractionism. And then earlier it seemed like you mentioned very limited actual attempts at redistribution. And so is the state being honest in that? Is it actually trying to fund redistribution through these extraction efforts, or is the money ultimately going to go somewhere else?
Actually, that's a good question. The money is going somewhere else, of course. Every country in Latin America every country has these redistribution programs, these cash transfer programs, but they're not all funded the same. So I forget which countries fund them through extractive industries. They don't all come from that. Some come from taxes. I think in Chile it comes from just taxes, and in Brazil I forget it comes from taxes also in Brazil. So it's the narrative more than the practice. In practice, it does not depend, and it's it's 0.2% of the GDP in Brazil. It's 1% of the GDP in Ecuador, which is the largest. It doesn't depend on extracting the Amazon to refund that, but the discourse of redistribution and oil being useful, right? The discourse is we cannot leave the money under the ground when so many people are poor and we need to fund for them. So it's this old discourse that you need to destroy nature to bring development to people, which is from the 70s, which we have contested largely. So it's not true. And most of the money doesn't stay into the country anymore anyways. The other question, the 100% is a really good question. I don't know what the answer is, and I think that's the challenge. What can be done? And is there an alternative? And there is the theory and the practice. In practice, now the Ecuador is in debt for 20 years to come because we have pre-sold oil from the Yasuni already. So it's not only this government has triplified, I forget how much, the external debt. And that's where it's interesting to compare the different levels. Lula ended the external debt of Brazil. Rafael Correa increased by a lot the external debt of Ecuador, even though it was the richest moment in history. He had more money in his government than the 30 years of extraction of oil in the Amazon together. How are we going to pay for it if not extracting? Because there is no more industries in Ecuador now. It's like Venezuela invaded France. We destroyed the little that there was. There used to be, for instance, 3 airline companies nationally. Now there is one that's collapsing, that's from the military. It's making billions. So even the big national businesses are collapsing and have left. So where are we going to create money to pay? It's going to end up being selling the country away again. I don't see how else in the immediate. Then that's the short term. In the long term, water.
Well, let's see.